Delighted to be joined today by Mohsin Zaidi. Mohsin, how are you, sir? You okay?
I'm doing really well. I just got back from a lovely holiday in Greece. So yeah, I'm happy.
Welcome back. How was the airport and the navigation of the tests?
Do you know what? I think it's mentally more challenging than it actually is when you're getting down to doing it. It's just you feel like there's like a crystal maze of different rules, which there are. But the government website's not too bad. And once you've navigated it, it's fine. And it's definitely worth the hassle.
Listen, your book, A Dutiful Boy, changed the narrative on growing up Muslim and embraced intersectionality. What do you find that people are taking away from your latest book? And how has the conversation changed for you over the last 18 months or so?
The interesting thing for me is I receive messages every single day from people all over the world, and not just queer Muslims, from people who were the first in their family to go to university, from people who grew up poor and then found themselves in a professional environment, and that kind of the gap between the two, between their previous lives that their families still live in and their current lives that they have with their professional colleagues, and messages from couples in mixed race relationships. So it's difficult to pin down one takeaway, but I think if I was going to ask for there to be one takeaway, then and put it into one word, it would be nuance. And the reason I say nuance is because I think that we live in a really divided world where we're almost expected to take one side or the other. And one of the reasons why intersectionality is so important to me is because none of us are just one thing. None of us exist just on one side of something and the other. And I feel like we've moved more and more into a world where we're expected to pin our colors firmly to one mast. But that's not how we operate as human beings. So the idea that we would be expected to do that with our identities and with our thoughts, to me, doesn't make sense. And so if I was going to answer your question, it would be nuance. That's the one message.
So when these people speak to you or email you or whatever they're doing, do you find it's generally they're talking about themselves, they're talking about perceptions of others towards them? What are they looking to address first?
Do you know, that's a really interesting question. And I think it differs. And usually the complication is people assume that they're the same. Right. That actually the way that you are perceived by the world is the same as the way that you should perceive yourself or feel about yourself. And one of the, I guess, the biggest challenges when it comes to coming from my sort of background was to extricate yourself from that idea that actually you are what you are told you are when you're raised. So when I was born in a very religious household, and I was told, actually not overtly, but environmentally, that being gay was inconceivable. And then I took those messages and I embedded them inside of me. And so the biggest difficulty that I found, and probably the biggest difficulty I found in the messages, and the tone of the messages I receive from people, is that the conflation of what will they think versus who am I and what should I think about who I am.
Can you give us an example of some kind of when you've had this paradox of who you are against who you want to be, and actually you've compensated it and almost, using strong words, sold yourself out in order to fit in more?
Absolutely, all of the time. I could give you so many examples. I'll stick to one. I was, for a very long time, embarrassed about being Pakistani. And the reason I was embarrassed was because after leaving Walthamstow, after leaving my Pakistani community, I entered a white middle-class world. And in that white middle-class world, when you said Pakistani, it was associated with, in Britain in particular, working class taxi drivers and shopkeepers. And the uncomfort there, the discomfort became acute when I was looking for partners. So I'd been in a gay bar and somebody would say, "Where are you from?" And I would lie. And I would say, "Oh, my family are from Iran," because I didn't want that person to think negatively of me because I was Pakistani. And actually what was going on there was self-hatred. I was projecting. What was happening was I was embarrassed because I felt like my working class heritage and my ethnicity would somehow put somebody off. And so I had to do what I could to cover those things up.
Yeah. Where do you think we are as a society on this journey?
I think that the generation below me, the younger generation, are much more comfortable talking about identity and owning their difference than people in their 30s and upwards are. However, I still think there's lots of complications with that. You get some young people who are very comfortable, but for most, it's still a real problem. So for example, the Albert Kennedy Trust is a charity that helps support young people who've been made homeless because they are queer. More than 50% of the young people they see in this country are Black or brown or ethnic minorities. So clearly, just because young people are better at talking about identity does not mean that everybody is having a great time.
And over the last year, one of the things we've seen, kind of as Speaker Bureau speaking to events, is we have seen a rise of virtual events, obviously, but virtual events where they're focusing on specific subjects, such as diversity and inclusion and areas around that. As we move to the next phase of the return to the workplace, what's your view on work and culture within the workplace and how we as a workforce are addressing diversity and inclusion, and whether actually almost the fact we've all had to be work remotely and the lockdown and stuff has gone virtual has helped progress the conversation?
I think there is two main points I would make. The first is around something I touched upon earlier, which is the binary nature of the debate. I think what that does is it scares people into not asking difficult questions or not having difficult conversations. The other day, I was driving along, and where my parents live is an area where there's loads of learner drivers. And I was getting really impatient. I was like, come on, hurry up. I need to get to wherever I was going. And my mum turned to me and she said, have you forgotten that you were a learner once? And I paused and I was like, you know what, Mum, you're totally right. But it also made me think about identity and all these difficult conversations that we're having in the workplace about diversity. It's so easy to forget that we are all learning and we're all at different stages in that learning process. And so for me, talking in a somewhat nuanced way about identity has come directly from having to live it. But not everybody has to live the same journey. And so there are going to be people who are well-meaning, but who don't necessarily have the experience that somebody else has. And I think that in the workplace, we need to make room for things to be less binary so that people can ask difficult questions without fear of offending so much. Then the second point I would make is that although I do believe that training such as unconscious bias has a role to play, for me, rooting everything in storytelling is the key to transforming culture. The reason I say that is because if you read an article, a Guardian article about, all the 3 logical reasons why we should all respect queer Muslims or people from diverse backgrounds, that's logic. And as a lawyer, I trade on logic. Yeah. But what I realize is that logic doesn't always help. What you need is empathy. And the best mechanism to provoke empathy is storytelling.
Let me just take you back and finally my last, you talk about questions and kind of having those discussions. Is there any practical tips or practical ways that we should be thinking or people should be thinking to ask themselves how to ask the right questions or what those questions are?
So I think the first thing is obviously pick the right time and place. But the other thing I would say is pick the right audience. So I, for example, in my workplace here at Hackler, I'm very open to anybody asking me what they perceive to be a difficult question or even an offensive question. So I've been actually not here, I've only been here 2 months, but I've had colleagues in the past who've said, can I have a really honest conversation with you? And I've said, yes. I don't get diversity. It seems to me like a fad. It seems to me like an opportunity for certain people to just get ahead. Is it more than that? And although that's quite a loaded question, I welcome the fact that it's an honest conversation. And I think that that's what we need to try and foster more of. But in terms of doing it in workplaces, for example, I'm a feminist. I wasn't raised as a feminist. I have learned to become one. But I still get things wrong and I still don't know the answer to everything. So I've identified now a former colleague, a barrister, who whenever I have a question around gender equality or something doesn't feel right, and I think, okay, I can't say this because this is going to sound controversial, I contact her and I say, look, this has happened. This is how I feel about it. What do you think? Am I being misogynistic? Is there something I'm missing? And often that difficult conversation with that trusted person is what helps to open my eyes, but also it can sometimes help to open her eyes, because my challenge is met in the way that it's intended, which is with good spirit and the intention of just making things better for everybody. So I would say finding somebody you can trust to have a difficult conversation with is a really important thing to do in the workplace.
Mohsin Zaidi, thank you so much indeed for your time today. Always a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of the day.